Good afternoon. Can everyone hear me okay? Okay, great. It is my pleasure to be here speaking with you all this afternoon. Really appreciate the invitation, Susan, to be here and to see some folks that I've gotten to know in the last year as I've settled into the area. So I hope to entertain you all today. I understand that there's been an illustrious line of speakers, including Susan's son, so that is intimidating. But I will do my best, and if you all have any questions at the end, please just let me know. Before I get started, I just want to tell you just a little bit about Petersburg National Battlefield for those of you who may not be familiar with it. Can I, just by show of hands, who here has been to either the battlefield in Petersburg or at City Point? Okay, so this is a fairly familiar crowd. Overall, the entire park includes about 4,000 acres, including the eastern front areas in the adjacent to downtown Petersburg, City Point, as well as land at Five Forks in Dinwiddie County and Poplar Grove National Cemetery. There's roughly 25 miles of trails throughout the park. It's a pretty extensive trails network. And we have a nonprofit partner, the Petersburg Battlefields Foundation. If you're interested in being more involved in the park, I'd really encourage you to take a look at them as well. Again, afterwards, I'd be happy to answer any questions about the park after the presentation. But what I wanted to talk to you all about today is what I would call kind of a sample pack, if you will, of stories that you may not be as familiar with of history in your backyard. So, as we all know, the individual actions of men and women aggregate to create a wave of an event. But the individuals within that, at any point, create an opportunity to steer events in one small way or another in one direction. What I want to talk to you about is some unusual moments that provide that opportunity that you may not know about. When you consider the Civil War, stories of people who are perhaps disenfranchised or lacking in formal power, and their contributions may not be as well known in history. Those are the stories that I find particularly interesting, and they're particularly important to the National Park Service because we want to make sure that the history of all Americans is reflected in our national parks. That's a key effort of ours that's underway and that I'm going to talk a little bit about today. So, as I said, today is a bit of a sample pack. I'm going to start with 14,000 U.S. colored troops who served in the Petersburg campaign. It's the largest concentration of black troops in the war. Brigadier General Edward Hinks' U.S. Colored Troop Division took part in the opening assaults on June 15th of 1864 in the Siege of Petersburg. That was the first major battle of the Eastern Theater in the war in which black soldiers were part, and the first time that a black division saw combat. Major General Edward Ferraro's division of the 9th Corps famously played a pivotal role in the campaign at the crater. But here's some stories about the U.S. colored troops that you may not know. On May 5th, in 1865, U.S. colored troops, regiments under Hinks' command, who were stationed out of Fort Monroe, captured Bermuda Hundred and City Point. As we all know, this became a pivotal supply and support location to take Petersburg. So just think for a minute what position the Army would have been in and the importance of that supply hub had the U.S. colored troops not had success there. It's also worth noting that there were 26 black recipients of the Medal of Honor during the Civil War. 8 were sailors, and 18 were soldiers. Of those, 15 received the medal for their meritorious actions during the Petersburg campaign. Not a well-known fact. In December of 1864, 3 divisions from the 9th, 10th, and 16th Corps were brought together to form the new 25th Corps, the nation's first and only all-black Army Corps. And this image on the screen here is of the 25th Corps' regimental flag, if you've never seen it. Not seeing anything? Well, that doesn't help. Oh, I know why. Sorry, stand by. There we go. Thank you for letting me know for the flag, so to speak. One story that you may not be familiar with is an unusual twist of fate that brought the 25th Corps to be present at a unique moment at the very end of the Civil War. In 1865, Mexican and French forces were gaining ground against the U.S., and the U.S. recognized Mexican state. The U.S. was concerned that fighting in Texas would escalate, particularly having just ended the Civil War. And so 50,000 troops were dispatched to Texas. The 25th Corps shipped out from City Point. This, of course, is an image of City Point during the Civil War. I'm sure many of you have seen this, of the bustling railroad and wharf and supply hub that it was. So the 25th Corps shipped out from City Point, bound for Brownsville, Texas, to help secure the border as a show of force. However, storms in the Gulf of Mexico required 4 regiments from the 25th to change course and ultimately land at Galveston, Texas on June 18th of 1865. So, as many of us know, at the conclusion of the Civil War, word that the war had ended and the Emancipation Proclamation had been issued earlier and that all black men and women were free did not reach everyone universally, all right? The 25th Corps would end up being witness to Major General Gordon Granger's issue and enforcement of the General Orders No. 3 on June 19th in 1865 in Galveston, Texas. So every year at the park for the last 2 years, we've held an event, we call it Shove-Off Day. It honors the moment at which this particular corps left City Point and ended up being part of history that is Juneteenth, that we now celebrate as Juneteenth across the country. I want to read to you the language of General Orders No. 3 if you've never heard it. The people of Texas are informed that in accordance with the proclamation of the Executive of the United States, all slaves are free. This involves an absolute equality of personal rights and rights of property between former masters and slaves. The connection heretofore existing between them becomes that between employer and hired labor. The freedmen are advised to remain quietly at their present homes and work for wages. They are informed that they will not be allowed to collect at military posts, and they will not be supported in idleness either there or elsewhere. So while we celebrate Juneteenth and honor that moment in which freedom was celebrated as far west as Texas, I think it's apparent in that second paragraph that black men and women, while free, were still seen perhaps as through a lens of lesser, viewed with perhaps inferior morals, things of that nature. And they were not alone in that. Women of the time in the Civil War were also deemed as weaker, second-class citizens. Certainly the Civil War, and many times even in present day, war is thought of as a man's fight. And during the Civil War and in history, oftentimes the narrative of women is about, being nurses or brave ladies maintaining the home front in the absence of their men. But this narrative of particular gender roles during the Civil War does not really tell the entire story. Dating back to the 1700s in Europe and to the American Revolution, there was a tradition of wives, sisters, and daughters who followed their men into service. They were referred to as canteen carriers, or daughters of the regiment, or vivandiers. They were usually young women who braved battles to provide water or spirits or care for wounded soldiers on the battlefields. Reports of them vary, being attired in uniform or practical clothing such as skirts above trousers, and carrying weapons, sometimes in more traditional clothes of women of the period. In general, their service is not well documented, but there are accounts of the women, including a woman named Bridget Devers. Bridget was an Irish immigrant and a Vandier attached to the 1st Michigan Cavalry, and there are accounts of her at City Point, where she was known for her high moral standards, her hard work, and her devotion to ensuring that her friends and brothers in the 1st Michigan Cavalry had the supplies that they needed. She was often consulted by other more formal groups, including the U.S. Christian Commission, to find information or locate a soldier in the camp at City Point. So you can see from these images that these women were not just nurses or laundry maids. The Vandiers may be just one example of the women directly on the battlefield. There are numerous examples as well of women taking on the appearance or the guise of a man in order to serve directly as a soldier. There are records of women receiving medals, recognition for their service, even official discharge papers and pensions for their service. Writing in 1888, Mary Livermore of the U.S. Sanitary Commission commented, "Someone has stated that the number of women soldiers known to the service as little as 400. I cannot vouch for the correctness of this estimate, but I am convinced that a larger number of the women disguised themselves and enlisted in the service, for one cause or another, than was dreamed of. Entrenched in secrecy and regarded as men, they were sometimes revealed as women by accident or casualty. Some startling histories of these military women were current in the gossip of Army life." So, while discovered and along the way many times through injury or through capture, women stood a smaller chance of being discovered than you might think. Most of the women who fought for the war were citizen soldiers, just like the men who enlisted, with no prior military training. So they would have been trained right along all the other recruits. Prevailing Victorian sentiments of the time compelled that most soldiers sleep clothed, bathe separately, and even avoid public latrines. Heavy, ill-fitting clothing would have concealed body shape, while recruits on both sides of the conflict were theoretically subject to physical examinations. These were usually just cursory examinations. They were looking for poor eyesight, maybe a limp, something particularly obvious along those lines. So we will never know for sure how many women directly served as soldiers. I've seen estimates in some of my research ranging from 200 to 700 or 800. There is no way to know for sure, but there are numerous contemporary memoirs and newspaper accounts and obituaries for women who served on both sides of the Civil War. One mystery that we may never solve is that of a woman who was found among the dead at the Battle of the Crater. Newspaper articles of the time give us a hint as to what might have been the case, and I'm going to read this to you now. This is from the Evening Star of Washington, D.C. It says, "The body of a white female soldier found in the crater at Petersburg. The Petersburg Index says that the grave diggers at the crater have unearthed, a short distance in front of that famous place, the body of a white woman dressed in federal uniform. The body was found in an excellent state of preservation." And by the way, some of this may be a little bit awkward language, so please understand it's of the time. "The body was found in an excellent state of preservation. The bust especially was perfect. The features, pallid with the hue of death, revealed the delicate cast of her woman's face, and her hair, though cut short, possessed a gloss and softness which alone might have excited a suspicion of her sex." Only wish my hair was always glossy and soft. "She had been shot through the head. She was carefully placed into one of the new coffins provided for her stern comrades and taken off with them to be buried amongst them." So while we don't know her name or the circumstances that brought her to be on the battlefield at the crater, I can tell you that there is a woman buried among the unknown dead at Poplar Grave National Cemetery. Another particular group that interest me are the Native Americans who fought and served and sacrificed in the Civil War. Consider that this is a population that had been forcibly stripped of and removed from their ancestral homelands only a few decades prior to the Civil War. Or, in some cases, they were involved in long and arduous negotiations with the federal government in order to remain on their homeland, such as in Michigan. In the mid-1860s, the discrimination and disenfranchisement of Native populations was most certainly living history for these populations, for these communities. And yet, at the outset of the war, a number of Native Americans enlisted or tried to enlist. Check and make sure we've got the right slide here. Yes. These two images are of two unnamed individuals who were Native American soldiers in the Civil War. The reception for those who tried to enlist, on the Confederate side, perhaps a little bit more accommodating, was more welcome. And a number of Indian tribes sided with the Confederates. On the Union side, early on, they were typically turned away because they lacked citizenship. They were not eligible. This changed in later years of the war with the imposition of a federally imposed draft, including quotas to be filled by each state. And as the toll of the war itself grew, the Union began to see the value of not turning away any willing soldiers. An estimated 20,000 American Indians fought in the Civil War for both the Union and the Confederacy. Tribes found themselves in a precarious position, either trying to stay neutral or, by virtue of where they were geographically, thrust in the midst of the fighting. Here in Virginia, the Pamunkey tribe, whose reservation is still only about an hour north of here, near I-85, served as civilian and naval pilots for Union gunboats and transports, and would probably likely have brought them through City Point. Similarly, the Powhatan tribe served as land guides, river pilots, and even spies. Some tribal leaders saw military service as a way to end the discrimination and even relocation from ancestral lands by joining either the Union or the Confederate Army and taking part in the responsibilities of citizenship. Native Americans hoped that their future prospects would be better. In some cases, for Indians in areas on the borders, the conflict, they had to make a choice. Do they side with the Union or do they side with the Confederates? With whom are they going to gamble their fragile future and stability within this country? One of the more well-known groups, of course, many of you may know, is the 1st Michigan Company K, a regiment of sharpshooters from the Ojibwa, Ottawa, and Potawatomi tribes who served on behalf of the Union in the Civil War. Company K included about 150 American Indians, including a man named Antoine Scott. Remember that name. I'm going to come back to that. Early in the war, Company K started their service guarding military storehouses or prisoners rather than being at the forefront of the fight. However, in 1864, they were called to join Major General Ambrose Burnside's 9th Corps of the Army of the Potomac, and they were part of General Grant's overland campaign, which brought them right here to the Petersburg area and, of course, to the Battle of the Crater, as well as many of the battles and skirmishes, Weldon Railroad, Peebles Farm, Fort Wadsworth, Fort Stedman, and Five Forks, which ultimately led to the end of the siege. Famously, on July 30th of 1864, the Federals detonated a mine, blowing a gap in the Confederate defenses. And of course, the accounts of the disorganized Union forces and their attempts to evade the Confederates raining fire down upon them and the bloody hand-to-hand combat that ensued in the crater are well known. The 2nd Brigade, from Brigadier General Wilcox's division, which included the 1st Michigan, was the 3rd unit to charge into the crater. And eventually, the native sharpshooters had gained a foothold on the Confederate defenses, but as we know, the circumstances prevented them from overcoming enemy forces. As the opposing soldiers rained fire down upon the crater, the Native American forces remained composed and determined amid this very gruesome situation. Lieutenant William H. Randall of Company I, who was captured during the fight, remembered that the, quote, Indians showed great coolness. They would fire at a Johnny and then drop down. They would then peek over the works just to see the effect of their shot. Accounts of the 1st Michigan and their actions at the Battle of the Crater showed that as federal forces attempted to retreat, sharpshooters, including Company K and Private Antoine Scott, covered their comrades. This is a quote from a notation from the Adjutant General's Office, War Department, dated February 1887, and it refers to Antoine Scott's valor at the Battle of the Crater and his recommendation for a Medal of Honor, dated February 21, 1865, as he was noted by General John G. Carter. Quote, Headquarters Army of the Potomac, dated December 22, 1864, for conspicuous gallantry, to wit, before Petersburg, July 30th, 1864, instead of screening himself behind the captured works, this soldier stood boldly up and deliberately fired his piece until the enemy was close upon him. When, instead of surrendering, he ran the gauntlet of shot and shell and escaped. So Scott was among the last to remove himself from the crater and from that chaos, and was recommended twice for the Medal of Honor for his astounding bravery. But the soldier passed away in 1878, and he never received any formal recognition. Of note is the fact that only 10 soldiers of Company K were still standing at the end of the Battle of the Crater, which from what had once been recruitment of 100. So while many wounded recovered and rejoined their ranks, this was tremendous losses for this group. Another intriguing story of Native American service during the Civil War is that of Eli S. Parker. Parker was a Seneca Indian from New York. His parents were from prominent Seneca families, including descendant of great tribal leaders on his mother's side. Parker was raised in a home that highly valued education and scholarship, and his education and his work in a law firm, as well as his relationship and acquaintance with Lewis Henry Morgan, who was a pioneer at the time in the field of anthropology, gave him entree into white society and institutions, despite his relative social status and his lack of formal citizenship at the time. Parker ultimately studied engineering at Rensselaer Polytech Institution and contributed to projects such as the Erie Canal in his professional work. It is through that work and through his efforts on government projects that he would come to know and befriend Ulysses S. Grant. Like other Native Americans, when Parker first attempted to join the Union Army at the outset of the war, he was turned away. However, Parker took his case to General Grant, and he was subsequently commissioned as a captain in May of 1863 and appointed as the chief engineer of Brigadier General John Eugene Smith's 7th Division during the siege of Vicksburg. After proving himself in battle, he was subsequently transferred with Grant as the adjunct to the U.S. Army headquarters and served Grant through the Overland Campaign and at the siege of Petersburg. At Petersburg, Parker was appointed as the military secretary to Grant with the rank of lieutenant colonel, and he was present at Grant's headquarters in City Point in late 1864 and early 1865 and wrote much of Grant's correspondence. The image you see here is one of Alfred Waud's sketches. It's titled Grant Writing a Telegraph that the Army has crossed the Rapadian River from 1864, and you can see Parker standing behind a seated Grant. Parker is also credited with helping to draft the Articles of Surrender at Appomattox. This is another Alfred Waugh document. This is a sketch of those who were present at the surrender, and I've circled the notation where Parker was noted to be standing. This is an image of Grant gathered with his staff. You can see Parker seated on the far left corner alongside Colonel Badeau, Major Babcock, and Colonel Horace Porter, all surrounding Grant. So while Parker was within the close circle of advisors to Grant, the accounts of him are of the time. They underscore his otherness and reflect the fact that he, despite his rise to importance and responsibility, he was notably different to those who saw him. This is an image of Parker seated in front of one of the cabins at the headquarters on City Point, at Grant's headquarters. And I want to read to you a couple of accounts about Colonel Parker. This first account is from Mr. J.T. Lockwood of White Plains, New York, and he says, "Our battery supported the 4th United States Artillery, and we were generally very close to Grant's headquarters, and I had ample opportunity to observe Colonel Parker. When Colonel Parker laid out breastworks or entrenchments, he always rode alone, except perhaps with an orderly. Whenever we saw him laying out fortifications, we knew there was to be a big fight. We also knew that there was an event ahead where he or Meade began riding over the fields from one headquarter to the next. We always supposed the Indian was one of Grant's chief engineers. Of course, I didn't know because I was only one of the rank, although we always stuck to Grant's headquarters." The second account is from General Horace Porter's book, Campaigning for Grant, and he says, "Colonel Parker, the Indian, had been diligently employed in these busy days helping to take care of General Grant's correspondence. He wrote an excellent hand, and as one of the military secretaries, often overhauled the general's private correspondence and prepared answers to his private letters. This evening, he was seated at the writing table in the general's tent, while his chief was standing a little in the distance outside talking to some of his staff. A citizen who had come to City Point in the employ of the Sanitary Commission, and who had been at Cairo when the general first took command there in 1861, approached the group and inquired, 'Where's the old man's tent? I'd like to get a look at him. Haven't seen him here for years.' Rollins, to avoid being interrupted, said, 'That's his tent,' at the same time pointing off to it. The man stepped over to the tent, looked in, saw the swarthy features of Parker as he sat at the general's chair. The visitor seemed a little puzzled, and as he walked away, he was overheard to say, 'Yes, that's him, but he's got all right sunburned, and since the last time I saw him.' So the general was apparently greatly amused by this incident, and he related the remarks afterwards to Parker, who, by this account, said that he was also amused. Hard to say. What's interesting to me, not only that someone of Parker's background played such an important role in Grant's staff, is that after the war, Parker would subsequently be appointed by then President Grant as the first federal commissioner of Indian Affairs in 1869. So this is a fairly prominent individual. I think the stories of the 25th Corps, of Bridget Devers, of the Unknown Woman from the Battle of the Crater, and Antoine Scott and Eli Parker are just a few examples of the breadth of history that's right here in our backyard, and we're only just beginning to highlight some of these lesser-known stories more fully here at Petersburg National Battlefield, including City Point. At Poplar Grove National Cemetery to our west, we're replacing the interactive kiosk, which will include highlights of stories of the soldiers buried there, including the Native Americans from Company K. At City Point this September, I want to tell you about two events. The first is on September 8th as part of the Hopewell Rivers and Roads Festival that will be taking place that weekend. We will have programs at City Point in the park. Please come out and join us. I don't have as much information about that one yet. That one's still in development. But later that month, on the 28th and 29th, we're also planning an event at City Point. It's referred to as Life Behind the Siege Lines. This includes examples of news photographers and sketch artists, telegraph operations, Union soldiers and Confederate POWs, hospital workers, and musicians. We will have educational activities there for people of all ages, including some of our local partners in museums. So those two events at City Point are September 8th and the following one on the 28th and 29th. I want to just conclude by saying that I think as we as a nation approach the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, I hope it's an opportunity for everyone in the nation to feel connected to the American story. But in order to feel connected to something, we have to first feel like we belong. And our story is included. So it's particularly relevant for my work and that of the team at the National Park that we begin to be inclusive with all of these stories and the diversity of stories beyond just the battles and the generals that we've all read and know so much about. So I hope you all will come out to the park and continue to explore some of these stories with us and learn more about the history in your backyard. And I'll stop there.